Many stakeholders continue to pore over the contents of the first part of the state capture report, which focuses on SAA Technical, SARS, the New Age newspaper and public procurement processes. Open Secrets facilitated discussions about the hits and misses in the state capture report last night. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Michael Marchant. He's the head of investigations at Open Secrets. Thank you very much for joining us, Michael. Now, it's a big document. It's covering a number of areas, but what are some of the key takeaways in the report for you?
Good afternoon, Nompumelelo. So I think that from our perspective, it was inevitable in a report of this length, and it's quite something to think that the 874 pages is just the first of 3 installments, and there's so much yet to come. But it's inevitable of something of this length that there were going to be things we were very excited to see, and that there were going to be some things that we felt the Commission didn't go far enough in terms of dealing with. In terms of the big kind of what we've called the big hits or things that we are excited to see, is that the Commission has really set out a clear agenda for prosecutions going forward. And I think that most South Africans will have been looking for that, looking for a call for accountability and looking for the Commission to be very clear and explicit about who is responsible for the collapse of entities like SAA, SARS and other places, and what must be done about it. And I think that in that sense, we now have a completely unambiguous agenda to put pressure on the National Prosecuting Authority and the Hawks to investigate and prosecute. And I think that without that kind of accountability, there's no way of moving forward.
Yeah, which then follows on to what you saw as some of the misses that came out of such a huge project.
Yeah, so I think that there are a few. I think the 2 or 3 that I think are most important. The first is that we're disappointed to see that the Commission has not really done enough to contextualize the social harm and cost of state capture. If you read the report without that context, you read it and it's almost as if there was no fundamental social harm that resulted to South Africans as a result of these practices. And I think that that's a mistake. If you look at the role of Dudu Myeni and PwC at South African Airways, for example, they're not just responsible for the destruction of an airline, they're responsible for the continual diversion of public funds away from social spending into an airline that was being run into the ground. Same with Bain and SARS. Bain are partly responsible for the massive debt problem that South Africa now faces and the years of struggling to collect revenue. And I think that that context of harm is missing from the report. And then one other big gap that we've identified or big concern we have is how the Commission seems to be pushing for deferred prosecution agreements. And this is something that's received support in a lot of corners, but particularly for the larger corporations, we have a concern that deferred prosecution agreements moves us actually further away from accountability, and that there's a lot of evidence from around the world that deferring prosecutions of corporations to strike deals does not always help in addressing, kind of preventing that conduct from happening again. Yeah. So those are 2 areas of concern.
I suppose then, based on what you say, it's actually a positive thing that MP Peter Hain in the UK has pushed for the British government to actually close or stop the accounts of Bain, which is an international company, and presumably we'd need more of that globally to hit the message home.
Absolutely. The one other thing that the Commission does touch on in certain areas is that it raises the issue of using debarment, exactly as you say, of stopping certain companies from accessing public contracts as a suitable punishment. And I think it's absolutely something that should be pursued. The Bain is a perfect example of it. But as we look forward to some future reports coming from the Commission, there's going to have to be similar questions about the big audit firms, KPMG, Deloitte, PwC, all implicated in state capture. A global bank like HSBC that was laundering funds for the Guptas while under an agreement with the US justice system, precisely because it had been laundering funds for other criminal enterprises. And those type of multinational corporations, I think, to see some kind of proper accountability, one way of doing that is debarring them for a number of years of accessing these types of state contracts.
That's going to be very interesting to see if it can happen or does happen. Of course, recommendations have been made that certain individuals that have been implicated should be investigated and, where possible, prosecuted. But in the South African context, given everything that we've seen of late, do you have the confidence that our investigating and prosecuting infrastructure and framework will be able to do that?
It's no doubt going to be one of the central concerns of everyone who is following the Commission, its report and the follow-up, is can the MPA, the Hawks and other law enforcement agencies, can they now move from this fact-finding towards prosecutions? I think there's certainly hope. I think that there are good signs within institutions like the SIU and elsewhere that there is the capacity and the will within those institutions to move towards accountability, to prosecute, but also to recover assets. I think what the Commission has done well is it has reminded the MPA that it's not only about doing the massive corruption cases, the large indictments around Eskom, Transnet and Estina. Those are important, but it's also very important to do what I would say are the slightly more simple prosecutions, prosecuting people in SOEs for failing to report corruption, for example, for failing to comply with the Public Finance Management Act or various other statutory requirements, for example, around bribery and corruption. Those should indubitably be within the capacity of law enforcement. And I think if they continue to fail to act on those things, we need to look very carefully at the individuals in those institutions potentially who are acting as bottlenecks to achieving accountability.
Yeah. And lastly, and very quickly, I mean, when we think of whistleblowers, we know some of them in the whole state capture reporting situation, they sacrificed a lot, sacrificed everything. If we look at somebody like Athol Williams, who gave testimony about Bain and SARS, he's had to leave the country in fear of his life and so on. Do you think whistleblowers are going to get the protection that they need going forward following the state capture?
So the role of whistleblowers and investigative journalists was absolutely vital to this commission ever coming into existence and these findings. I think it is very encouraging that the commission has noted unequivocally that currently the framework is not sufficient to protect them. And they've made some very clear recommendations to consider an agency to offer better protection to whistleblowers and also to offer potentially financial incentives in order to protect those who, as you've said, are forced to lose their jobs and lose their livelihoods. The next question is going to be whether the institutions tasked with implementing that do it. And it should be one of the first priorities of those institutions in terms of taking the recommendations forward.
Indeed. Michael Marchant, thank you very much for your insights there. He's the head of investigations at Open Secrets.